like if you go to a networking event and it's your first time, make it a goal, right? How many meaningful conversations do you want to try to have? It's those interpersonal connections that will really drive that network for you.
Welcome to Women Talk Tech, the podcast for business professionals committed to advancing women in the tech sector.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Women Talk Tech. I'm your host, Wiese, and we are kicking off our final series of 2023, and we're calling this the Trailblazers series. And I have a special guest today on the show, Laura Payne, and Laura and I met at a really, really incredible event back in July. That seems like a lifetime ago now. And we were at a really great event all about ambition. And we surveyed our community and had what we call the Ambition Survey. And we were looking at findings and the two themes that emerged from our survey. And it was about how men give advice to young women about what they should do and how women give advice to young women about what you should do. And as you know, the goal of our podcast is to get more women into the tech sector and to get more young women in particular encouraged about a career in tech. And men recommend the path of apprenticeship and finding mentors to learn from and follow in your footsteps, while women recommend the path of being the trailblazer, creating your own path forward, regardless of what people expect from you. So we wanted to explore this idea more. This is why we wanted to launch this series on the podcast. And I can't think of a better guest to have to kick off this series than Laura Payne. And I'm going to let Laura explain a little bit more about who she is. But she's the Chief Enablement Officer at a company called White Tuque, and she's built her career over 20 years at one of North America's largest banks, and she has 15 years working in information security. So there's not just jobs in tech, but then there's jobs in security, and that is a whole other level of security, and we're going to get into that. And a lot of diverse experience. But most importantly, Laura is actively engaged in mentorship, especially for those who want to get into the security field. So welcome to the show, Laura.
Thank you. Oh, what a kind introduction.
And thank you for being a trailblazer. I am so glad that you chose a career in tech, and then you chose a career in the part of tech that is probably the most complicated to wrestle to the ground, in my opinion. Is cybersecurity not on everybody's radar these days? You must be overwhelmed with calls and people saying, sort my problems out for me.
It's certainly an interesting field to be in. And I think what makes it really interesting is that technology is a core component of your security, but it's all about how people, process, and technology work together. And it's one of the reasons why I think, and I'm not alone in thinking this, women excel in this field. If they can get their foothold in and get started, there are a lot of women who are doing fantastic things in security, which is really exciting.
Okay, let's talk about how you got your foothold in. How did you get started? Were you one of these people in high school that said, I am going into tech, this is what I'm doing?
You know what? I was the person in high school who didn't know what she wanted to do, so I took everything. And I feel kind of badly for students now. I had 5 years of high school, and that was the norm, right? Back when OAC was still a thing. And it meant that I could take a second English, at OAC. I could do all of the sciences. I could take all of the maths. I ended up going into engineering, but I was debating between engineering, architecture, computer animation, there were just kind of like a number of different things. And then what I did was I actually ended up going into a practice of engineering that is pretty much a bit of everything. So it was systems design engineering at the University of Waterloo, which covers all of the bits of engineering disciplines to, kind of the inch deep and a mile wide. And they referred to it as, the jack of all trades and maybe a master of one, right? You might specialize to some degree. I didn't know at the time that a lot of my courses would actually be good primers for a career in security. But looking back, I can see that there was just a lot of things that covered from, the computer science aspect to human factors in design and everything in between, critical thinking, of course, and all of those things. So I did not know that this was where I was going when I started. And and it was actually because of the co-op jobs that I worked 3 jobs with one team at Bank of Montreal, which was where I then started my full-time career. And it was in that team 3 or 4 years after graduation that there was an opportunity for a security officer role. And that was my first movement in specifically the security direction at that time.
Right. Okay. Now let's talk just a second about the engineering piece, because that always interests me. There's oftentimes not a lot of women in engineering either. That seems to be something that people don't gravitate to. Why did you gravitate to engineering? What did you think an engineering degree was going to give you?
So my dad was an engineer and my mom went to Waterloo. So in some ways it was just like, okay, this is, marries the two together.
Right.
But, I was always interested and proficient in math and science. And I like the idea of solving problems, and I still like solving problems. And that's, I think, really what drove me ultimately towards engineering and specifically systems design, where it was a very broad set of problems that you would potentially get to work on and dig into. And I think part of, so 2 things around the women in engineering. So one is definitely seeing more women in engineering will help and has helped. And the engineering diversity has certainly improved over the course of time. The other thing that really changed, so I mentioned the 5 years of high school, and you could take a lot of different courses when you had an extra year of time to choose things to take. The year that they went from 5 years of high school to 4 years of high school, engineering enrollment by women went from the mid 20 percentile to in the teens. In 1 year, step backwards. And I think that speaks to engineering, and rightfully so, has a very high requirement of courses that you need to have to be successful the way engineering is structured as an undergraduate program. And it is, if it's not the only one, it certainly was the only one at the time that's a profession. You get a professional degree, you can become a professional engineer with only an undergrad. You don't need to go on and do a master's to become a professional in that field, as opposed to if you think of doctors, lawyers, so on, right? So that means that you need to think early on in high school about having those prerequisites if you want to be an engineer. And if you don't have your English and your 2 maths and your 2 sciences, and sometimes it's 2 specific math courses and 2 specific science courses, you're not going to engineering. Science saw a huge uptick of women enrollment in that same year. So I thought that was really interesting.
That is interesting.
Not great, but interesting.
And for our American and international listeners, in the province of Ontario in Canada, we used to go to what we called grade 13. We would have 5 years of high school or 13th grade if you... I know they have a slightly different system in the US, but I can't remember what year that changed. Because I'm old and I forget these things. Yeah. But I can't remember the year.
I think it was 2004. It was 2003, 2004, right around that time. Yeah.
Okay. And that is a really interesting stat. Now, we're hovering around 22-23% of people in the tech sector are women, and it has stagnated. It has not grown. It is not going up. You're somebody who's deeply involved in the cybersecurity space. What's interesting about it? How would you sell it to someone?
Well, if you like doing different things, you're going to get a lot of different things to do. And I think sometimes it sounds like, it has this sort of stigma around it of being like really hard and really complicated. But everybody starts somewhere, right? So your first job out of the gate isn't going to be, well, it might be hard, but it's not going to be overly complicated. And so I think a lot of it is, getting started. A lot of security jobs are also not super well defined. So it is often more about working that network, right? Building a good reputation among people you've worked with, especially if you're looking to kind of change careers. Can you find people and build some working relationship with them who would be good connectors for you to get into that first role? We're challenged right now with entry-level positions, I think, across the board. Everybody wants somebody who's got 5 years experience, and they want to pay them like a junior analyst. But you don't find those people. Why? Because they don't exist, right? So
right.
That's, a bit of a challenge too, as well as finding a job that's respectful and honors whatever experience you bring to the table. Or now, I don't know this is fact, but it's certainly anecdotally, that women will apply for jobs where they feel they've got 80 to 90% of the qualifications. Whereas, some of these job postings are very unrealistic in what they're expecting. So some of it's just putting yourself out there.
The whole reason we did the ambition survey is because every single person I've had on the show, without exception, has referenced that stat of women not applying for things unless they felt they were 100% fit, and men will do it at 60%. And so we're not casting a very good net into the types of people that we want to bring into the profession or to bring into the tech sector. And we're not doing it in a great way. And I think, I think that's a message that employers need to hear. And I think that's a very, important message that you're putting out there, that it's not really just about, to your point, your years of experience. I think it's about somebody who understands what's going on in the world, understands how that impacts security in an organization. It creates challenges. And you mentioned this idea of problem solving. And you mentioned this idea that certain things appealed to you because of problem solving. And again, so many people on the show have said they found their way into tech because they like to solve interesting problems. And I'm going to say something maybe controversial, but I think women are really great at solving complicated problems and solving interesting problems. And I think more women need to hear that message about where that is applicable. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think the other thing too is most of my roles have been because I had a relationship with somebody, and when the opportunity arose, they recognized that, hey, maybe we should ask Laura if she's interested, right? And there were opportunities where that happened and I wasn't interested, and that's okay. And then there were some opportunities where I went out for it myself, but the majority were ones where somebody was willing to approach me. And I think part of that is, I don't want to say building your brand because that's not quite where I want to go with that, but it's don't undersell yourself. I've worked with one lady, and I noticed that she would start everything that she had to say with, well, you can disagree with me if you want, or, just kind of undermine it before it came out of her mouth. Or I might not be an expert in this area like you are, but here's what I think. And I think a lot of people do that to themselves, women and men, actually, who are, not very confident feeling. And even if you don't feel confident, why would you undermine what you have to say before it's even out there? It's a bad habit. So I tell people stop that if you do it, right?
Right.
Because then people will see that you are smart and see that you have thought. And even if you're wrong, at least you thought about it and you had something you wanted to contribute. It's okay to be wrong sometimes, even me.
So let's talk about the cybersecurity landscape right now, because I think listeners are going to be interested in this, and then we're gonna sort of jump to you as a trailblazer, and because you're working for an organization now that is a bit of a startup, right? You kind of came up with this idea and decided that this type of service was needed in the marketplace, and instead of waiting around to see if somebody else would start it and hire you. You jumped in with both feet and figured it out. What is happening right now in the industry and specifically emerging trends? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So we were really founded on the whole vision that there are big players who can afford security at big prices, but everybody needs security and they all deserve the opportunity to have security for their business at a price point that's aligned to their size, scale, and risk. And that's really what we've been trying to build with what we're doing. So it's an interesting journey. We haven't, I don't think we've totally cracked the formula yet, but we're well on our way. And we're not afraid to try things out and see what works and what doesn't work along the way. But the emerging trends really are it's clear, right, that it is not just big companies that are targeted. Those are the ones you hear about in the news. But the facts are that when it comes to small and medium enterprise, if it's not you, it's the guy next to you who's going to get an incident or have an incident this year. And it might be as minor as, an invoice or two gets misdirected and the funds are, directed into a fraudulent account. And they're leveraging technology to make that happen. To your whole company is subjected to ransomware, and to be able to recover, you are weighing some very difficult options. Do you pay a criminal to hopefully give you back your company? Do you try to recover from the backups you hopefully had? So from that perspective, the only thing that's new about all of those things is just, I think, more awareness is coming to the front that everybody is a potential victim. And there's other, more kind of ugly, complicated things coming down the pipe that will be difficult to deal with. The threat of quantum computers against the way we do asymmetric encryption right now, but all problems are tractable, and they're easier if you already have a good security practice in place. So
right.
Yeah,
I was a victim of data loss, and not because of somebody being. I had a legitimate company who just screwed up and lost 10 years of data on me. And they were supposedly, now I would call them criminals, but they were actually supposedly in business. And, so I don't think anybody is immune from this issue. And I don't think anybody, no matter what you do and no matter how big or small you are, can say that they are immune from things happening online. So I do think, it's a really interesting area. I think it's an area that's just starting to really open up in a lot of different ways. And I think it's a great part of the tech sector from the perspective of, I can't think of an area where you're learning as much and doing as much as the whole security piece. Let's switch gears for a second, though. Let's talk about mentorship. And I know that that's a big part of what you do and who you are. And you're very open to, so listeners, pay attention, listen up, be very open to talking to people who want to enter the security field. And I'm interested, could you share some of your insights on mentorship?
Yeah, I think it's really about building a relationship. And while I appreciate and I am pretty lenient in my accepting of requests on LinkedIn, it's really hard to build a mentorship relationship out of, like a first contact that's through a platform like that.
Right.
So I think it's really important if you're trying to establish community, and mentorship is just, one of those aspects of community, is to look at what's available to you locally or nearby in the form of meetups and conferences and things like that. And most security folks are introverts, so this will be a little bit painful to get over, but you have to self-invite yourself to the party, right?
Right.
You have to find the opportunity and say, yes, I'm going to get out of my comfort zone. I'm going to feel like I don't know anything and everybody else there knows everything. And by the way, every other person there also feels like they don't know anything, even if you've been in the industry forever. The more you know you don't know. But I think that's a great opportunity and a great way to find people who are your peers, right? Are trying to make paths inwards, and people who you can build relationships with, who may have had a similar journey to yours, or just are the right stepping stones for you to get started.
Right.
And that's usually where I find my mentees. So that's why I would suggest it.
Would that be the same advice that you'd give to women and sort of underrepresented individuals who are trying to, have a successful career, get into tech? Is that sort of the same advice you'd give?
Yeah. I think it's pretty universal advice. There's no secret sauce to it. It's, if you're trying to get into an area that you don't have an established network, your first order of business needs to be establishing some sort of network, right? And you're not looking to make friends with everybody. But, if you go to a networking event and it's your first time, make it a goal, right? How many meaningful conversations do you want to try to have? If it's an hour, maybe you're just trying to go and have one meaningful conversation with somebody. If it's a day, maybe you try to have 3 or 4 meaningful conversations. But it's those interpersonal connections that will really drive that network for you.
I have to say, I'm recently new to paying attention to the tool Meetup, and I'm using it because I chair a peer group in the tech sector. And we threw an event a couple of weeks ago in North Carolina, and we posted it on Meetup, and it was only supposed to be for people who were attending this conference. And we just happened to use the Meetup tool. And we had 2 young women come out to the event who just saw it on Meetup and registered. And it turned out that one worked for a bank and one worked for a tech company. And so they saw it and said, well, let's go. So I have to say, I immediately gave them extra drink tickets and said, thank you for being here, because, I thought, good on you. You just decided to go to a party you really hadn't been invited to. And that worked with all of these people in the tech sector. And I thought, more people need to follow that lead. And to your point, get out of your comfort zone, show up, be there to have a couple of conversations.
Yeah. And be willing to accept too. If you take the risk and you invite yourself to a party, they might tell you when you get to the door that you can't come in, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world. And just, pick yourself up, dust yourself off. It wasn't the opportunity that was meant to be. And the next one will be better. Now,
if anybody ever comes to my parties, I never say no to them. Just for all of our
there
listeners.
We go.
If you show up at my door, I'm inviting you in. So, but I think that's really sound advice. And I think, as I said, that I just think the whole area of security is one that everybody needs. It will serve you well as a career choice. And I thank you for the work you're doing, and especially the work you're doing in mentorship. You've been listening to another episode of Women Talk Tech, and this has been our Trailblazer series. And I've had the good fortune to speak to Laura Payne, who's the Chief Enablement Officer at White Tuque. Thank you so much for being on the show, Laura.
Well, thanks for having me, Marie. Really appreciate it. And it was fun.
And we will put in the show notes how to connect with Laura, but she's obviously open to connections and open to talking about mentorship. So I always say, seize the day, seize the moment.
Absolutely.
You've been listening to Women Talk Tech. I'm your host, Marie Wiese. And as always, thank you so much for listening.